Hello, my name is Dr. Frayne Olson. I'm the Crops Economist and Marketing Specialist at North Dakota State University. I'm here to discuss the overview of food soybean economics. First, I want to start out with a basic review of the cost and returns comparison when we look on a per acre basis between conventional soybeans and food type soybeans. The information on this slide has come from the North Dakota and Minnesota Farm Business Management Associations. There's a record-keeping system that farmers participate in to help with financial management, but they also provide their summary information at the end of the year so we can make some comparisons between the cost of production for various different crops. And in this slide, we've got the 2014 and 2015 summaries. I just want to make, again, a very quick comparison between conventional soybean and the food-grade soybean returns. Average yields, food-grade soybeans tend to have lower average yields. This can be borne out or seen in the slide. This is not uncommon. There's two main reasons for this. First is that some of the food-grade soybean varieties that are raised don't have the yield potential that conventional soybeans do. And for those that do have relatively comparable yields, there are also some additional clean-out or additional screening that the food soybean process goes through. So when you determine the amount of actual bushels sold, where the revenue is generated from, there's a difference between the amount that's produced in the field versus the amount that's actually delivered and sold to the processor. Average prices for food-grade soybeans tend to be higher. Now understand that in these record analysis, the food soybean is a wide variety of products. It could be anywhere from non-GM soybeans to specific natto beans that are used for tofu production, could be for soy milk production. So there's a lot of different food soybean products that go into that category. So would be the average of all those different types. But as you can see, there is significant price premium that's offered for growing food soybeans versus the conventional soybeans. As a result, there are higher returns per acre for food soybeans versus the conventional soybeans. Again, the higher prices typically offset the lower yields. When we look at production costs, we break these into two categories. First would be the direct expenses. Those are the expenses that are committed to producing a crop every year. And I'll go through in more detail in a moment some of the specific categories that go into this direct cost expense area. But as you can see, there are very similar production costs. These are, again, the out-of-pocket costs for growing the crop. The overhead costs, again, tend to be relatively similar across the conventional versus food-grade soybeans. In most cases, there's no specialized equipment that's necessary for producing food soybeans. So again, the costs for the overheads, which would be primarily machinery, buildings, those types of things would be very similar. At the end of the day, when we look at returns per acre, the returns from growing food-grade soybeans are significantly higher than they would be for the conventional soybeans. Now also understand that there's going to be farmers on the conventional side as well as the food side that have a little bit higher returns or lower returns than listed on this slide. So this is an average of all the producers that are participating in this particular program. When we look at direct expenses, so this is an itemized list of the direct expenses. One of the areas that most farmers want to spend some time discussing is the difference in seed costs. Most of the conventional soybeans that are produced right now have some kind of genetic trait that's been added to the soybean. And because of that, there's a technology fee that's added to that. So the cost for the seed portion of conventional soybeans versus food-grade soybean are different, food-grade beans being obviously lower. On the fertility side, fertilizer requirements should be very comparable. If you'll notice in 2014 for the food-grade soybean category, there is a higher production cost or higher fertilizer cost. That's primarily because of unique condition on a couple of the producers, some of the farmers who were just getting into soybeans, and they had additional fertilizer costs. Chemical costs for the food soybeans tend to be a little bit higher. The chemicals that are available for the food soybean are a little bit more expensive. Sometimes it takes multiple applications. And so there's this offset. The seed costs tend to be lower for food-grade soybeans versus the chemical costs tend to be a bit higher. Then the last basically direct production cost that I want to talk about is land rents, because in this particular classification, land rents is included as one of those direct expenses. And again, there should be very similar costs for the land that's used to produce food soybeans versus conventional soybeans. I do want to point out in 2015, the food soybean Land rent is significantly higher, but again, it's kind of a unique situation based on some of the farmers that were growing soybeans in that particular year. When we look at the returns, as we noted earlier, the returns from producing food-grade soybeans were higher. But that return is really the return to labor and management. That's the expected amount of money available for the owner-operator to be able to, as earnings for their labor and management they've contributed. That's the amount of money that can then be spent for family living expenses or for continued growth of the farming operation. But understand that food soybeans also require additional management. One of the areas is pest control. One of the advantages of conventional soybeans is that with the genetic traits that have been added for pest control, it makes it easier for farmers to control those weeds, those diseases. And because all of the food soybeans are non-GM or non-genetically modified, there's some additional management requirement to be able to monitor weed, disease, and insect problems, as well as then to be able to control those problems. There's also, because of the kind of pesticides or the kind of chemicals that are used to control these pests, more often than not, you have to apply those pesticides more often. And so there is kind of a trade-off again on the pest control side. Preventing cross-contamination is another area that requires additional management. Most food-grade processors and end users are very concerned about making sure that the soybeans that are delivered are pure and free from other crops, contamination from other crops and or weeds. And this really means that for both planting and harvesting equipment, there's additional cleaning requirements. You have to clean them very thoroughly to make sure that there's no seeds left over from another crop that might cause problems within the processing or handling the supply chain. In addition, the trucks, grain carts, storage bins also have to be very cleaned very carefully to make sure that there isn't any residue or any kind of cross-contamination possibilities. And in some cases, some end users, some buyers also require some additional record keeping. They'd like to know specifically what seed varieties were used, what kind of pest control procedures were used. They want some verification of yields for the different fields that were planted to food soybeans. They also would like, in some cases, previous cropping history, so they have an idea of if there are some contamination issues, where that contamination may have come from. Now, most of the food soybeans are produced under contract, so it's a contractual relationship between the farmer, the producer, and the processor. And then there's a second contract between the processor and the end user. Now, most of these contracts have very specific production practices. They have lists of acceptable seed varieties, in some cases, lists of acceptable or unacceptable pesticides or desiccants that are used to try and dry the crop before harvest. They may have some rotation restrictions, limits on how closely certain crops can be rotated with the food soybeans, and then any other production practices that are kind of required that might be unique to that particular end use. One of the nice things about the food soybean contract is that the flexibility that there is in the pricing. So there's two basic contract structures. One of them uses a fixed price, where the farmer will come in and negotiate a contract price with the processor. The contract price is determined, the cash price is determined at the time that you sign that contract. Another one that's becoming very popular is a fixed basis. Just as a reminder, basis is that differential between the local cash price, the cash price received by the farmer, and the respective futures market price. So that differential, that difference between the cash price and the futures price, is fixed at the time that the contract is signed. But then the producer has the flexibility to be able to lock in or fix the futures price later on at a later date. Now, most of the time, the futures market price is fixed on or before a specific date. So there's a time limit that the farmer has to be able to play the flexibility in the pricing game. Now, in most cases, the basis level or this differential is a premium. So there's a premium, a higher price that's offered as compensation for the additional management and additional risks that are associated with producing food soybeans. Now, the amount of premium that's offered, it does vary from year to year. It can vary from company to company. It can also vary from type of food soybean produced. So that's one of the things that you need to be following very closely. But there typically is, again, this premium offered to try and compensate for the additional work involved. The contract amount is usually fixed. The contract is actually for a number of acres produced. And so the contract and the contract price and the contract requirements cover all of the bushels that are produced on those particular acres. And so the acres need to be identified within the production contract as it's being negotiated. Quality specifications should also be listed. Again, this is a food product, and so the quality specifications are usually a bit more restrictive or a bit tighter than they would be for conventional soybeans. And again, in some cases, there are premiums or discounts for particular quality characteristics. If this occurs, those should be listed in the contract or at least discussed ahead of time. For very low quality soybeans, if there's a significant problem, they may be rejected and again would have to be sold through conventional soybean channels. Kind of some final comments here. Delivery location can be important. Many buyers, many of the processors require that the soybeans be delivered directly to their processing facilities. Some do allow delivery to an alternative location like a local elevator, but most would prefer, because of traceability, to have the product delivered directly to their processing location. Now, from a farmer's perspective, this could influence the transportation costs, which are usually part of the requirements for the farmer, and can at the end influence the net returns for producing food-grade soybeans, depending upon how far that has to be transported. Another issue would be the timing of delivery. Most food soybean processors list what they call a buyer call provision within the contracts. This buyer call, basically what happens is the buyer notifies the seller when delivery is required. Now, delivery, there's usually a delivery window, 1 or 2 week period, where the buyer says, we'd like you to deliver your product within this window. The seller then is expected, or the farmer is expected, to store the soybeans until that delivery requirement or until they're notified. And again, because of the timing differentials between harvest and these delivery windows, several months may go by and you need to have enough storage capacity to be able to handle those. Now, usually, again, payment for the soybeans is made at the time of delivery, so there can be some additional financing costs that may be needed or required to fill that gap between harvest time and when the crop is actually delivered and sold. Finally, a few additional considerations. With any kind of production contract or any kind of marketing contract, be sure that you always read and understand the contract provisions before signing it. If you have any questions, the processor or the buyer would be more than happy to discuss and try and negotiate any kind of concerns you have. One of the other things I want to point out is this issue of counterparty risk. So the question is, what happens if one of the parties does not or cannot fulfill the contract provisions or the contract requirements? The issue is really understand who you're doing business with, understand the company that you're signing the contract with, make sure that the company has a good, strong reputation, has some history within the industry, has strong financial conditions, so you're not worried about making sure that payment is received at a proper time. And then the last issue or the last comment would be federal crop insurance provisions have changed recently and allowed some higher price elections, some premiums for the food soybean classes. Now, the amount of premium for this crop insurance price elections does change a bit by the type of food soybean or the food soybean class that's characterized. So be sure that you check with your crop insurance agent to make sure that you understand the options that are available and that you choose the appropriate levels. So I'd like to thank you for your time and appreciate the opportunity to participate.